にレシピ本が見つかったにもかかわらず、じゃあはしばらくクッキングダムに戻らなかったのだ。
Yeah, also for some reason he started cackling maniacally and said that everything was going according to Keikaku. Nah, the guy was also weirdo, so I'm sure it was nothing. We return from the week off to a good start by not having the usual opening narration, and in fact, we won't be needing this at all, as you-know-who was still on vacation. Like seriously, why did they even bring in a narrator when this franchise has never needed one? I mean, someone really should go back to the OG and maybe make a 4 or 5 part video series comparing them. Anyway, this episode featured Kokone's parents returning from their trip to Isiki, the country Princess Maika was from, and I guess they were at least trying to justify that waste of an episode by calling back to it here. I mean, it didn't really succeed, as that episode's plot wasn't really relevant here, but whatever. The plot here was that the princess wanted the Fuas to help make some new cuisine for her little kingdom to improve tourism. Nah, just slather a burger in gravy and put an egg on top. That's our idea of fine cuisine here in Hawaii. But no, they wanted to make a big project out of it, including setting up businesses and farms, which I guess would require them to be there in person, so...
家族でイースキ島に引っ越ししたいと考えているんだ。
I'm sorry. What?
Yeah, I'll be sure to complain about this overused trope a little later. Still, while I do have my complaints with this plot and its predictability, this scene of everyone reacting to the news was pretty hilarious, especially this bit of pom-pom suggesting how Kokone could continue to be a Precure, if only because I really like British musical comedies. Though frankly, all of this was overshadowed by Rosemary's subplot that really by this point should be getting a lot more focus, especially this late into the game, as he and Dr. Strange exchanged intel about their master. As it turned out, Ginger had seemingly gone AWOL after the recipe bone had been stolen, and yeah, I honestly hope they're not going in the direction that I think they are, and that this is just a red herring, because, well, we'll save that discussion for another day, which is also what the show wanted to do.
すまない。つい話が耳に入ってしまって。
Yeah, can we just forget about the stupid yams and just go back to the exposition? I mean, the show only has 10 episodes left. Granted, they did talk about it a little more, but it was mostly just recap, and Rosemary saying that he'd go talk to Mata later, which I'm just gonna assume is gonna be 5 episodes from now at the pace we're going. Still, we then did get a good scene with Kokone's parents discussing how they go about creating new signature dishes for Isiki by using local ingredients and collecting opinions from the citizens. We kind of joked about the local moco earlier, but having known the family who originally made it, I can say that's pretty much how that dish was made, so yeah, good stuff all around. Granted, there's a certain someone else they really should be asking her opinion for, and yeah, let's get into my 2 biggest issues with this episode. After a couple of days worth of montages where they really hammered it in that Kokone was going to leave a lot behind if she were to move away, we got a bit of Kokone contemplating what she should do while sitting on a park bench. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, as much as they're trying to make this an emotional scene, it's not really hitting with me. And that's a bit of a shame, as there's some really nice animation here. Not so much this falling leaf sequence that's moving at about 10 frames per second and clearly on a loop, but more so everything with Kokone, especially her hand movements here. God damn, that looks so smooth. However, while the production has been going above and beyond, it's been in service of this plot. Okay, putting aside the predictability of this little plot, let me just ask one question. Why would Kokone ever agree to this? With moving away plots like this, it was clear that the characters themselves had a hand in how they ended up in this predicament, and thus it was kind of their responsibility to resolve it. Here though, Mr. and Mrs. Fu are kind of dropping a massive bombshell on their daughter, in spite of there being a lot of obvious issues that come with moving to a foreign country. In fact, for most normal families, rather than constantly trying to convince their kid that they should move, the conversation would more likely go like, "Hey honey, what do you say we move to this backwater country that's still ruled by a monarchy?" Oh, don't worry, we know that you're at an impressionable age and that you might be leaving a lot of friends behind, but come on, I'm sure you can make a lot of new ones in this vaguely European country, where you also might need to learn a new language, and in fact, you might have to deal with an insane amount of culture shock, and you know what, this was a bad idea, forget we said anything. Oh, this tempura is good. Seriously, just based on how little they actually discussed this with Kokone, I want to say these two are pretty awful parents. I mean, sure, they managed to find a compromise by the end, but this really should have been something that they ironed out on the first night. Give it some thought, honey. I'm sure this is a lot to take in. No shit, Dad. But my bigger issue with this was that in spite of this clearly being a big climactic character arc episode for Kokone, there's been no real build up to it. In fact, I think my biggest problem with this season, and probably the root cause of a lot of its narrative botches, is how there's very little, if any, build up to a lot of these plots. I feel like that's where they might be going with the Ginger subplot, and definitely here. I mean, like, let's just really compare this with Yukari and Reika's season finale stories. Because of their refined upbringings that drove them to become better, inevitably found themselves on crossroads where they had to decide how far they wanted to take their ambitions. Meanwhile, Kokone's arc has been more about her overcoming her social anxieties and improving her communication skills. Now, you could say that's kind of the case here with her needing to say no to her parents, but again, that's hard to do when they're not really asking the obvious questions from the offset, and instead we have to sit back and watch her sulk for most of this episode. Yeah, and whose fault is that? Seriously, between this and the old geezer from last week, this show cannot write good parental figures. Anyway, Secretary attacked and got herself some pitas. With Kokone busy finally talking things out with her parents, the remaining three went in without her, and surprisingly, we got an Amane variation of the trio roll call. I mean, it's still a very underwhelming pose, but points for putting in at least a little bit of effort there. In fact, this week's fight was also really well animated, with the return of the Tropical Rouge duo of Yutaka Tsuchida and Ken Ueno coming back to direct and animate respectively. Granted, they might be trying a little too hard to turn Yui into Manatsu.
Hey, phrasing!
And of course, Kokone came in for the save and gave the standard "I'm not gonna leave you guys," which again would have had a lot more meaning to it if she had some personal stake in this beyond her parents being needlessly neglectful this week. But whatever, the show is clearly allergic to stakes of any sort. With that, the episode ended with Mrs. Fua going to Isiki alone while her husband and daughter remained in Japan. So yeah, anyone wanna bet she's gonna come back to the country when extra bun in the oven? Episodes like this really do frustrate me, as while there are legitimately good elements to it, it's ultimately brought down by the writing, like much of the show. Visually, this was one of the stronger outings for both the fight and even that one scene at the park. It's just unfortunate that the latter was in service of some very forced drama. To me, few things are narratively worse than unearned melodrama. It was one of my biggest problems with Hakuto, and one of my biggest for this season. I'll say right now, Kokone will likely be my favorite Cure of the season, if only because she's remained at least the most consistent in her writing. She has developed from the rich girl introvert to someone who can at least assert herself both to her team and to her parents. In the case of the latter, I just wish the scenario was a little more thought out. Again, it just feels like the show wants to emulate some of these old tropes, but doesn't understand why they worked in the first place. A story like this could have worked if Kokone shared in her parents' dreams of spreading their cuisine far and wide, or at least had more of a hand in the princess wanting their services. But nope, it was just about her asserting herself more, which, while that has been a major part of her arc, it just felt kind of needlessly drawn out here, on top of Moving Away being a bit of an overused trope of this franchise and toy shows in general. Thankfully, at least some of this was held up by Tsuchida and Ueno's great direction. I wouldn't be surprised if they insisted that this episode have as much visual storytelling as possible considering their previous work. Helps that they brought out a few of their remaining meme faces that they had left over from last season. And even if it was fleeting, at least we got a little more Cook Kingdom lore building. Thus, overall, I do think this does kind of balance out to just an okay episode, though with visuals like this, I do wish it were more top tier. For now, though, we just have to move on to next week and the return of him. November is the month where we are just going to take things just a little easier as the new year is quickly approaching. Don't worry though, that doesn't mean we're not working on new projects like ones that you might have been asking for and that we may or may not have hinted at in this very video. Stuff like that might be getting its time to shine sooner than you might expect. Still, until then though, farewell for now my friends, and sir, do you need any help or do you want to drown that little outhouse of yours?